Old grocery store cashier is fired unjustly, but days later, karma strikes hard. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Margaret Turner scanned a loaf of bread across the register, the familiar beep blending into the hum of the grocery store. Her hands, wrinkled from years of labor, moved with practiced efficiency. She'd been a cashier at Greenway Market for 27 years, long enough to know half the customers by name, long enough to feel like she was a part of something. $10.05, Mr. Henderson, she said with a warm smile, handing the elderly man his receipt. Thank you, Margaret. Don't work too hard now. She chuckled. You know me, I wouldn't dare. But the truth was, she did. She worked harder than most. Greenway Market wasn't just a job, it was her lifeline. At 62, with no family left and a modest pension that barely covered rent, she needed every shift she could get. Across the store, a voice boomed. Margaret. A word? She turned to see Devin Russo, the new store manager, standing near the customer service desk. Young, sharp-suited, and full of self-importance, Devin had been with Greenway for less than 6 months. He was the kind of boss who cared more about efficiency reports than the people who made the store run. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. Yes, Mr. Russo. His expression was unreadable. Come with me to the office. Her stomach twisted. She followed him through the aisles, past the rows of cereal boxes and canned goods she knew like the back of her hand. The office was small and cold, the air filled with the scent of stale coffee. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Devin leaned forward. Margaret, I'm just going to cut to the chase. We've had some concerns about your performance. She blinked. Concerns? I've been here nearly 3 decades, Mr. Russo. No one's ever had concerns before. Well, times are changing, he said smoothly. We need to be more efficient, and quite frankly, you're not keeping up. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. I may not be as fast as the younger cashiers, but I know this store inside and out. Customers trust me. Devin sighed as if he were being forced to explain something painfully obvious. Look, we've received complaints. Your scanning speed is slow. You take too long chatting with customers, and just last week, a register was short on your shift. Margaret's mouth went dry. I would never steal from this store. I'm not saying you did, he said, his voice oily. But errors like that add up. She gripped the arms of the chair. Please, Mr. Russo, this job is all I have. Devin stood, smoothing out his tie. I'm sorry, Margaret, but we have to let you go. The words hit like a slap. Fired. Just like that. She opened her mouth to plead, but the look on his face told her it wouldn't matter. This was already decided. As if to drive the final nail into the coffin, Devin pushed a crisp white envelope across the desk. Your final paycheck. And, we'd appreciate it if you didn't make a scene. Margaret stared at the envelope, but didn't take it. For nearly 30 years, she'd given this store her heart, and now she was being tossed out like expired milk. She stood, her legs shaking beneath her. I hope, she said quietly, you never find yourself in the position you've put me in today. Devin didn't respond. Margaret walked out of the office, past the aisles she had memorized, past the customers who would wonder where she had gone. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, a gust of wind whipped at her gray cardigan. She felt invisible. She had no plan, no savings to fall back on. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Groceries weren't going to pay for themselves. Tears stung her eyes, but she swallowed them down. As she turned the corner, she glanced back at the store one last time. She had given Greenway Market 27 years, and in return, they had given her nothing. Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the unopened envelope. Her final paycheck. The apartment was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. It wasn't much, just a modest 1-bedroom in an aging complex, but it was home. At least for now. With a deep breath, she tore open the envelope. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and her stomach dropped. Barely enough to cover rent. Certainly not enough for food, bills, or medication. Margaret closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. She had worked hard her whole life, had given everything to that store. And now she was left with nothing. She took a deep, shaky breath. She needed a plan. The next morning, she left early and took the bus downtown, scanning the streets for help wanted signs. At her age, finding a new job wouldn't be easy, but she had no choice. She stopped at a small cafe, the kind of place where people lingered over coffee and fresh pastries. The sign in the window read, hiring part-time help. Margaret stepped inside, adjusting her cardigan. The air smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. A young woman behind the counter smiled. "Welcome to Millie's Cafe. What can I get you?" Margaret hesitated, then cleared her throat. "I saw the sign in the window. I was hoping to apply." The woman's smile faltered just slightly before she nodded. "Of course. Let me get the owner." A few minutes later, a woman in her early 50s emerged from the back, wiping her hands on an apron. "Hi there, I'm Millie. You're here about the job?" Margaret nodded. "I've been in customer service for nearly 3 decades. I know how to run a register, how to handle people. I need work." Millie studied her for a long moment. "Listen, I'd love to help, but this job involves a lot of running around, carrying trays, lifting boxes. It's fast-paced." Margaret forced a smile. "I can keep up." Millie hesitated before sighing. "Tell you what, I'll let you do a trial shift tomorrow morning. See if it's a good fit." Relief washed over Margaret. "Thank you. Truly." She left the cafe with a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But life had other plans. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the cafe at 6 sharp. The moment she stepped inside, she knew she was in trouble. The morning rush was chaos. Baristas shouted orders, servers weaved through the crowded space, and the register beeped nonstop. Margaret did her best, but her hands trembled as she tried to keep up. Her fingers fumbled with a cash drawer. A latte order got mixed up. And then, as she turned too quickly with a tray of coffee cups, disaster struck. The tray wobbled, and before she could steady it, steaming coffee splashed onto the counter, dripping onto the floor. A sharp yelp followed. Margaret turned in horror to see a young man clutching his shirt, now stained with coffee. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, grabbing napkins. Millie rushed over. "Margaret, are you all right?" The man shook his head, brushing past them. Millie sighed. "Margaret, I appreciate you trying, but I don't think this is going to work out." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She nodded numbly, slipping off the apron. She walked out of the cafe, jobless once again. By the 3rd day, Margaret had gone through half a dozen places, each rejection hitting harder than the last. "You're overqualified. We're looking for someone younger. We need someone who can move quickly." By the time she got home that evening, her feet ached, her body was exhausted, and her spirit was broken. Her fridge was nearly empty. Her savings account was a joke. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Despair. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the bills she couldn't pay. Then, she did something she hadn't done in decades. She wept. She wept for the years she had given to a company that had thrown her away. She wept for the world that had no place for people like her anymore. She wept because she had no idea what to do next. And just as she was wiping her eyes, a sound startled her. A knock at the door. Margaret frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door slowly, and there, standing in the hallway, was a familiar face, Lisa Monroe, one of the regulars from Greenway Market. "Margaret," Lisa said, her expression full of concern. "I just heard what happened. They fired you?" Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Lisa shook her head in disbelief. "That's not right." Margaret let out a humorless laugh. "Doesn't matter now. It's done." Lisa crossed her arms. "Actually, it does matter. A lot of people are upset about this." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa hesitated before pulling out her phone. "You need to see this." She tapped the screen and held it out. Margaret's breath caught. It was a video of her. Someone had recorded Devin firing her. The footage showed everything, the way he dismissed her, the way he ignored her pleas. And the comments were flooding in. "This is disgusting. She worked there for nearly years. How heartless can you be? Boycott Greenway Market." Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through the thousands of comments. The video had gone viral. Lisa smiled. "Looks like karma's already knocking." Margaret didn't know what to say. But for the first time in days, hope flickered inside her. Something was about to change. Devin Russo adjusted his tie, exhaling sharply as he stepped into Greenway Market. It was barely Am, but something felt off. The moment he walked past the front registers, the first cashier, a young man named Carlos, refused to make eye contact. A few feet away, Anita, one of the deli workers, shot him a glare before turning her back. Devin frowned. Then he saw the line of customers at the customer service desk. The air was thick with murmured complaints, and the lone employee handling returns looked overwhelmed. Devin strode over. What's going on? The employee, a college student named Brooke, bit her lip. We've had a lot of complaints this morning. Complaints about what? Brooke hesitated, then slid her phone across the counter. Devin's stomach dropped. The video. It was everywhere. The footage of him firing Margaret had gone viral, racking up millions of views overnight. The comments were brutal. Heartless, never shopping here again. I hope this guy gets fired next. His pulse pounded as he scrolled through post after post, each one dragging his name through the mud. Then his gaze landed on the hashtag, Justice for Margaret. His hands clenched. This was bad. Before he could react, a voice cut through the store. You should be ashamed of yourself. Devin turned to see an older woman, her arms crossed over her chest. Firing a woman who gave her life to this store. For what? To save a few dollars? A murmur of agreement rippled through the checkout lines. Another customer, a man in his 40s, held up his phone. You see this? This video is everywhere, man. Nobody wants to shop here anymore. Devin forced a tight smile. I assure you, Greenway Market values all of our employees. The woman scoffed. Then why is Margaret gone while you're still standing here? A few shoppers clapped in agreement. Devin's jaw tightened. He turned on his heel and stormed toward his office. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Margaret, meanwhile, had no idea just how much the tide was turning in her favor. She sat at her small kitchen table, still reeling from the video Lisa had shown her. I can't believe people care this much, she murmured. Lisa chuckled. Are you kidding? People love you, Margaret. Everyone in town knows you. They grew up with you at that register. You're part of this community. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. For so long she had felt invisible, easily replaced, easily forgotten. But now, for the first time in years, she realized she mattered. Lisa reached into her purse. By the way, I have something for you. She handed Margaret an envelope. Margaret hesitated before opening it. Her breath hitched. Inside was a check, a large one. Lisa smiled. A bunch of people chipped in to help. Customers, neighbors, even people who just saw the video online. It's not just about the money, it's about making sure you're okay. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She had spent her life giving to others, never expecting anything in return. And now, when she needed it most, her community had shown up for her. She covered her mouth, shaking her head. I don't know what to say. Lisa squeezed her hand. Say you'll take care of yourself. And say you'll watch what happens next, because I don't think Devin's gonna like what's coming. By the next morning, Greenway Market was in chaos. Sales had plummeted. The usual morning rush was reduced to a trickle. Customers were actively avoiding the store. Devin sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. An email from corporate blinked at him. Subject, urgent, public relations crisis. He clicked it, his stomach churning. Devin, we've been monitoring the backlash from the Margaret Turner situation, and it's reached a critical level. Sales have dropped by overnight. We're receiving pressure from local media, and a petition demanding your resignation has gained over signatures. We need immediate damage control. Contact us ASAP. Devin's hands trembled as he checked the petition. Over, people, calling for his firing. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, doing everything by the book. And now, because of one old cashier, his entire career was on the line? His phone buzzed. A call from corporate. He hesitated before answering. This is Devin. A stern voice came through. Devin, we have a serious problem. Customers are boycotting. Local news is running the story non-stop. We can't afford this kind of bad press. Devin swallowed hard. I didn't know the video would blow up like this. You fired a beloved employee on camera. What did you expect? Devin gritted his teeth. So, what do we do? There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end said something that made his blood run cold. You step down. Devin shot up from his chair. What? No, this wasn't my fault. This is bigger than you now. If you don't resign, we'll have no choice but to terminate you publicly. And trust me, you do not want that kind of stain on your record. The call ended. Devin stood frozen, heart hammering. This was it. Karma had come full circle. He had thrown Margaret away without a second thought. And now, he was the one being discarded. By the end of the day, the news had spread. Devin Russo, the store manager who had fired Margaret Turner, had resigned in disgrace. When Margaret heard the news, she didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply sat in her chair, sipping her tea, letting the weight of everything settle. The store that had tossed her aside had suffered the consequences. The man who had dismissed her so easily had lost everything. And yet, Margaret felt no anger, only peace, because for the first time in a long time, she knew that she had won. Days later, Margaret stood in front of Greenway Market for the first time since she had been fired. The automatic doors slid open, but she didn't step inside. Instead, she just watched. It wasn't the same store she had spent nearly 30 years working in. The once bustling aisles were now nearly empty. The cheerful greetings from cashiers were gone. Even the shelves looked poorly stocked, as if the soul of the store had vanished along with its customers. The backlash had done real damage. Even after Devin resigned, the public wasn't ready to forgive. Greenway Market had issued a formal apology, but it wasn't enough. The video had exposed something deeper than just one unjust firing. It had become a symbol of how corporations discard loyal workers without a second thought. Margaret sighed and turned away. She had no reason to go back inside. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's life changed in ways she never expected. Thanks to Lisa and the overwhelming community support, donations had poured in, not just from local customers, but from strangers across the country who had seen her story. A GoFundMe campaign had raised more than enough to cover her rent, bills, and groceries. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worrying about how to make ends meet. She could breathe again. One afternoon, she sat in her small living room, staring at a check in her hands, one that represented a new beginning. Lisa sat across from her, smiling knowingly. "So, what are you going to do with all this support?" Margaret exhaled. "I've been thinking about that." She set the check down and looked Lisa in the eye. "I want to give back. People helped me when I needed it most. I want to do the same." Lisa leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" Margaret smiled. "Something simple, a small food pantry maybe. Something for the folks who don't have anywhere else to turn. You'd be surprised how many people in this town struggle." Lisa's grin widened. "I love that. And I know a few people who would love to help." Margaret felt something she hadn't in a long time. Purpose. She had spent decades working for a company that had discarded her the moment she became too expensive. But now, she had the chance to do something that mattered. Not for a paycheck, but for people. Meanwhile, Devin Russo was experiencing his own version of karma. After his resignation, he had expected to land another management job quickly. He had connections, experience, and a strong resume. But none of that mattered anymore. His name had become synonymous with corporate greed. Every time a potential employer Googled him, the viral video appeared. The headlines were brutal. Former Greenway manager forced out after unjustly firing beloved employee. Backlash continues as customers boycott store over viral firing. Devin Russo out. But is it too late for Greenway Market? No one wanted to touch him. For the first time in his life, Devin was on the other side of the table, facing rejection after rejection. And as his savings dwindled, he began to understand something Margaret had known for years. Job security was an illusion. Loyalty meant nothing to the corporate world. And now that he was the one struggling, there was no safety net. No second chances. Months passed, and Margaret's small food pantry became a reality. She ran it out of a donated space in an old community center, stocking shelves with essentials, canned goods, fresh produce, bread. People came in every day. Single mothers, elderly folks on fixed incomes, people who had fallen on hard times. And Margaret greeted each of them with the same warmth she had once brought to her cashier job. She listened to their stories. She offered them kindness. She had found her calling. One afternoon, as she was organizing donations, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Margaret." She turned around, and there, standing awkwardly in the doorway, was Devin Russo. Margaret blinked, momentarily stunned. He looked different. Gone was the sharp suit, the arrogance in his posture. Instead, he wore a faded button-down and slacks that didn't quite fit. His eyes, once filled with sharp confidence, now held something else entirely. Regret. Margaret set down the box she was holding. "Devin," he swallowed. I didn't know you were running this place." She crossed her arms. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated before glancing at the shelves. I need food." Margaret studied him. The man who had fired her without a second thought was now standing before her, humbled, desperate. It would have been easy to turn him away, to tell him he didn't deserve help, but Margaret wasn't like that. She never had been. Without a word, she grabbed a grocery bag and began filling it. Rice, beans, fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread. When she handed it to him, Devin looked stunned. Helping me? Margaret met his gaze. That's what we do here. He swallowed hard. I don't deserve this. She shrugged. Maybe not. But neither did the people you turned away when you ran that store. Devon lowered his head. For a long moment, he just stood there, gripping the bag. Then, softly, he said, I'm sorry. Margaret didn't say anything, because in the end, words didn't matter as much as actions. She simply nodded. And as Devon turned to leave, she hoped, truly hoped, that he had learned the lesson that life had been trying to teach him. Because karma always comes full circle. But mercy? That's a choice. And Margaret had made hers. Wow, what a journey. This story proves that karma always finds a way, and true kindness never goes unnoticed. What do you think? Did Devon get what he deserved? And what would you have done if you were? Margaret, let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale. See you in the next one. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.